if the servant is in a position to decide how much of the resources of the master he spends, then he is no longer the servant. He has become the master. The founders recognized the danger of allowing unlimited taxation in the hands of the government and prohibited it. They specified that the federal government's access to the wealth of the people was necessarily through a couple of controlled avenues, with the apportionment mechanism being the predominant one as far as direct taxes are concerned. Apportionment means that the overall burden of any tax is distributed among the state governments in relationship to their populations. And the state governments are actually the entities responsible, liable for the tax. The state governments are the ones that pay the tax. That form of direct taxation has been implemented in America on a number of occasions. It was the predominant form of taxation that financed the federal government, with the exception of the tariff, throughout the first 120 or 130 years of our history. Didn't happen real often, in part because the federal government's overall revenue was low. The amount of money the federal government spent was minuscule by today's standards. In fact, up till 1910 or so, the federal government's budget had never exceeded, I believe, 3 or 4% of the national gross national product. Today, it routinely eats up 21% of the gross national product, and that's without consideration of the costs of compliance, the regulatory burden, etc. Adding up all burdens based on the income tax and the regulatory structure and the compliance costs distributed amongst the states and the federal government, we're probably approaching 45% of GDP as a taxed component of our wealth. We allow money to be extracted from us in vast quantities, which is used then to finance the activities of bureaucrats who attempt to supervise every waking moment of our lives. That's what we are subject to today. As you say, the time that we were willing to go to bloody revolution 230 years ago, 240 years ago, we weren't facing even the tiniest percentage of that degree of offense against us, and yet it was sufficient. Interestingly, at that time, our experience as British citizens then had set a standard for us that at this point is buried beneath layer after layer after layer of superseding offense, much greater proportion. We have fallen far. There are two main reasons why people are afraid. Maybe three. One, because the IRS and the tax structure that it appears to administer and enforce appear contrary to everything that everybody ever learned about how the American government was supposed to work. The income tax appears to be contradictory of the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment. It raises people's hackles automatically because it is alien, because it's wrong, because it's improper. It appears that to be improper. Two, when you're dealing with people's wealth and people's earnings, you're dealing with something that is critically important to their personal well-being. This is not a peripheral issue, a peripheral area to people. People's earnings are their lives. That's how they live. It's whether they can afford to go to school. It's whether they can pay for health care. It's whether they can be housed and whether they will eat each night. This is very, very important material, very important area. And three, because the IRS carefully cultivates an atmosphere of fear associated with its subject matter, in part because it wants people to simply do what they're told. In greater part, it is because human psychology says that what you fear, you avoid. And it is in the interests of the system today for people to avoid the subject in general of the income tax. The government and the IRS does not want people looking closely at the income tax law, for instance. They don't want people to read that law. They want people to, when they encounter anything that has anything to do with the income tax, to look the other way and occupy themselves with other matters, rather than study, become educated, come to an understanding of what those laws actually are. And so there is this carefully cultivated, very deliberately cultivated aura of fear associated with this subject. The most feared agency in the United States government, in the federal government, that's what the IRS likes to, it wouldn't surprise me to discover that they don't keep that, on little plaques on the walls of their offices and take great pride and satisfaction in the fact. You would think that someone would be embarrassed to be associated with frightening the people that they work for, theoretically, but not in this case. The federal government is perfectly capable of raising all the money that it needs. In fact, direct tax, which is a tax in which Congress makes clear what it is they intend to spend the money on. It's a one-time deal. It has to be renewed every year. If indeed the American people want to be financing all of the things that government spends money on today, all that's required is for Congress to stand up and say, we want, at the moment, $2.3 trillion this year. This is what we're going to spend the money on. And we're going to have a vote in Congress to see whether this is going to fly. And next year we're going to come back and do it again. And we'll see if you re-elect the same crew next year, speaking to the American people. We'll see if you put us back in office so that next year we can take $2.4 trillion, which is the current trend, to go up in those kind of increments. I think that given that opportunity to make that clear-cut of a decision, we would find that the American public actually didn't re-elect those people that told them that they had to spend $2.3 trillion of their money this year on bridges to nowhere in Alaska and paving virtually all of West Virginia and every other pork barrel project that Congress manages to dream up. But that would be the way to find out. That would be the way to find out just how legitimate these expenditures are. Theoretically, we are told that everything Congress does represents the will of at least 51% of the American public. That's how our system is set up. It's that kind of a majority system. Well, if it's true, then why not ask directly? Why not put it on the line in the sense of saying you have the opportunity to say whether you really want these things done or not by means of a direct tax like that, an apportioned direct tax. So Congress could raise every penny that the American people legitimately intend for it to have. And that would be the mechanism. No, actually, it precludes the federal government from taxing any of our rights. Certainly, something isn't a right if it can be, if a cost of exercising it can be imposed. The government is given the authority to tax itself, to tax its own activities, to tax things that involve the exercise of the powers that we delegated to it. It can tax the profitable exercise of federal prerogatives. Just as if your neighbor comes to you and asks if he can set up a lemonade stand in your driveway, you have the authority and the right to demand a piece of the action. the federal government could do the same thing. When you come and say, I want to make a deal, I want to exercise some of your powers, I want to exercise some of your authorities and make some money doing so, the federal government can say that's fine, and I get a piece of the action. We get a little chunk of that. We get some of that income. And that's what we have. There is no authority in the hands of the federal government to tax someone for simply engaging in contract with someone else, to tax them from engaging in trade, to tax someone for acquiring money, for possessing money. And in fact, there is no tax on any of those things as well. No tax has been even nominally imposed on any of those things. The income tax is, in fact, a tax on the exercise of federal prerogatives. This is revealed in many different ways in the law, and also the history of the law and the Supreme Court rulings about the law. Although the fact is that the term income itself is not formally defined anywhere. But we see what the tax is applied to, identifying clearly what income can be. So, to get back to the question, there is no constitutional authority for a tax on earnings. There is no constitutional authority for a tax on wealth, on money, on contract, on trade. The government is prohibited from any tax on those things. To tax those things would be to tax a person in the exercise of their own rights. That would be a direct tax. The Constitution specifically prohibits a direct tax other than through the mechanism of apportionment in two places in the Constitution. At Article 1, Section 9, and in another section that I can't recall the location of right offhand. But what's important to understand is that income is none of those things. Income is not earnings, it is not trade, it is not contract, it is not money. It is nothing but the benefit of the exercise of a federal prerogative measured by the dollars associated with that exercise. That's what income means legally. And that is, in fact, what is taxed under the income tax laws. When we look at those laws in sufficient detail, paying attention, careful attention to the definition of terms and the mechanisms by which the tax is imposed, the mechanisms by which it is collected, enforced, established, etc., we find that it is 100% consistent with that definition. We find that the Supreme Court rulings regarding the income tax are 100% consistent with that definition. We find that the initial enactments and subsequent enactments of the laws, where they are explicit, are 100% consistent with that definition of income. And we find that only that definition of income can reconcile what would otherwise be a conflict between, for instance, the 16th Amendment, which didn't initiate the income tax, but which had a role in broadening its implementation somewhat, or at least ameliorating a limitation on its implementation that the Supreme Court had found in the appellate court ruling. That provision would be in irreconcilable conflict with the prohibition against direct taxes that we see in Article 1, Section 9, and in that one other place that I can't recall the location of in the Constitution. Those two things can't coexist. If income means earnings, money, wealth, trade, contract, what have you, all that comes in, so to speak, or anything related to all that comes in, then it would be an irreconcilable conflict with the prohibition on a direct tax. So we have all the statutory elements, all the Supreme Court rulings, all the administrative components of the tax, all 100% consistent with income as nothing but the benefit from the exercise of federal prerogative measured by the dollars associated with that exercise. And we find that that's necessarily the case if the Constitution is not to contradict itself. So, there is no tax on income in the sense that we are led to imagine that term to be, but there is tax on income in the sense of that term properly understood. It does give Congress the right to tax incomes, but that's a right that Congress had to begin with. Again, the issue is the meaning of income. What it does not do is it does not give Congress the right to tax earnings. It doesn't give the Congress the right to tax all that comes in. The 16th Amendment came about because under the existing income tax structure, particularly the Income Tax Act of 1894, a fellow who owned stock in Farmers Loan and Trust, a fellow named Pollock, challenged the intentions of Farmers Loan and Trust to pay an income tax prior to paying dividends to him on the stock. Pollock said that to tax the dividends is the same thing as taxing the stock that I hold. The stock I hold is personal property, and therefore it would amount to a tax on my personal property, which would be a direct tax. And since it's not apportioned under the 1894 Act's structure, it's unconstitutional. In other words, he said, to tax the fruit is to tax the tree, and you can't tax the tree other than by apportionment. The Supreme Court agreed with Pollock and said that he was right, that even though the stock that he held was stock in a federal instrumentality, Farmers Loan and Trust was a railroad investor, among other things, and the Supreme Court had earlier in that century established that the national railroads were federal instrumentalities. They said even though that's the case, and even though because of that connection, earnings associated with that investment would technically be taxable because they would constitute the exercise of a federal prerogative. It was profit proceeding from partial ownership of a federal instrumentality. Because taxing the dividends constitutes a tax on the stock, and the stock is personal property, it's unconstitutional. So, the 16th Amendment was proposed. The 16th Amendment says that a tax on income can take place without resort to the source, which is to say, as explained by the Supreme Court subsequently in the Brushaber versus Union Pacific Railroad case, 3 years after the passage of the 16th Amendment, or the alleged ratification of the 16th Amendment in any case. The 16th prevents a resort to the source, that is to the tree, in an effort to prevent the application of the tax to the profit, to the fruit. So, in the 16th Amendment, Congress will have the authority to tax income from whatever source derived without regard to apportionment. This means that Congress can place a tax on the benefit from the exercise of federal prerogative, even though that benefit may be realized by a connection with personal property. The personal property can't be resorted to thwart the tax. The Supreme Court has upheld an income tax, and as such, the court has upheld a tax on the benefit of federal privilege measured by the dollars produced through its exercise. That kind of a tax is an indirect tax. Engaging in the activity of exercising a federal prerogative is a voluntary act. No one can be forced to do it. No one has to do it to make a living. It is entirely voluntary. Anyone who's chosen to enjoy the benefits of the exercise of a federal prerogative voluntarily takes on the tax burden that's associated with it. And so, a tax on income, when that term is understood to mean what the law says it does, is clearly an indirect excise tax, and thus clearly constitutional without apportionment. Mostly because it hasn't been understood before now. The fact is, it was not, in my own case, I had been making a study of the subject for several decades, off and on, in varying degrees of intensity. But it was not until I was prompted to do so in the year 2000 and beyond that I had access to a digitized Internal Revenue Code, digital access to scans of the statutes at large, back to 1862 and before, for that matter. Those tools made a world of difference in being able to actually leap through the 3,417,000 plus words of the Internal Revenue Code, which is itself a condensation of the statutes that it represents. The statutes are larger. If you add the regulatory structure, the Code of Federal Regulations associated with the code, you more than double the size of that body of work, that body of verbiage. At that point, you're talking more than 8 million words. And prior to the time of digitization, it was not possible to, it was not humanly possible for anyone to actually go through that material in any kind of depth and to any kind of effective purpose. But come the year 2000, when I was obliged to, due to the service's refusal to accept my return as submitted, their demand that my wife and I endorse their characterization of the term income on that form without any qualification, I took advantage of those digitized formats and was able to find my way back to the initial 1862 Revenue Act, where the whole thing was launched, discover, interestingly, that the current Internal Revenue Code continues to reflect laws passed well before the 16th Amendment. In fact, probably 30% of the current Internal Revenue Code references statutes passed before the 16th Amendment was passed. To trace the evolution of the income tax from 1862 to the current time and uncover its completely consistent, completely constitutional, completely hidden meaning.
On the other day that
Thanks for making it.
I was kind of reading through some things, and I told her, I said that did you know that the income tax for this country is voluntary, and that you self-assess yourself on when you file? And she said, I'd never heard that before.
Well, it is indeed a voluntary program. The receipt of income is associated with engaging voluntarily in certain activities connected with the federal government. And it is only people who volunteer to engage in those activities that are subject to the tax.
What do you mean? Say that in simple terms.
Simple terms?
Yeah. I'm a simple girl, I don't understand.
That's why I married you, honey.
The federal government has a claim of right in the exercise of its own powers.
Okay.
Anything that is done, anything that's profitably done that involves the exercise of an exclusive federal power, it can take a piece of that action. And it does, and the form that it takes that piece of the action is the income tax. The tax is on the activity itself. It's not on the receipts associated with it, but it's measured by those receipts.
So activity meaning your wages?
Activity meaning the conduct of a federal office. For instance, running a federal land office, selling federal lands, performing as a public servant is an activity that's
Okay.
a federally connected activity. Holding a federal office in the sense of an elective office is a federal activity. And any
Government employees?
government employees,
Post
government office
office.
holders, post office, military people.
Okay.
In simple terms, you could say everyone who is paid for their services by the federal government
Okay.
is engaged in a federal activity, engaged in the exercise of a federal prerogative, a federal power. And the government has what amounts to a return of part of that remuneration.
What does that word mean?
Remuneration is compensation, pay for services.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is if you don't work for the US government, then you don't have to pay taxes on your personal income.
It's not quite as simple as that.
Okay.
It's the exercise of a federal prerogative, which in the largest sense, or for the most part, means working for the federal government, but it also means holding investments, profitable investments in federal government entities, such as federal corporations, like a national railroad, for instance.
Okay.
A national railroad actually is a federal instrumentality,
Like Amtrak.
like Amtrak. That's
Okay.
the good current example. Anyone who owns stock in Amtrak and receives a dividend as a consequence of that ownership has received income.
Okay.
They have invested in the exercise of a federal privilege, of federal power, and profited thereby. So that also constitutes income. So it isn't just working for the federal government, it's being economically involved with the federal government in explicit and particular senses. It isn't using Federal Reserve notes, that doesn't count, because that has nothing to do with you yourself exercising a federal power and benefiting thereby. It's something that the federal government facilitates, but that's not the same thing.
But like, you know, Joe Blow Six-Pack out there that's working as a logger or somebody that's a waitress or, you know, people that have regular jobs that aren't tied in with the US government,
Their earnings
their
don't
earnings are
constitute income.
voluntary.
Yeah, it's important to understand that income in the sense of the revenue laws doesn't mean what we tend to think of that word meaning. It doesn't mean what the dictionary would define the common word income to be. The dictionary would define the common word income to be all that comes in, meaning all receipts, all the money that somebody receives during the course of any given period. In the law, income has a much more narrow meaning. It only means the profitable exercise of federal privilege, which is a simplified way of putting it itself, but in essence, that's the meaning of the term. So when the law says anyone receiving income must do this, that, and the other thing, they're not talking about anyone who receives money. The law is talking about anyone who receives this specialized, defined kind of receipt,
And that's federal,
a federally connected receipt.
right, okay.
So those people they're taxpayers then? Those people would actually have the moniker of taxpayer?
Taxpayer is anyone who is subject to an internal revenue law. That's the definition of the word taxpayer, meaning, or being taxpayer, all one word. T-A-X-P-A-Y-E-R, taxpayer. That's not the same thing as taxpayer, the two-word version, which is somebody who pays taxes. It's just a generic common term or phrase that we all fall into. We all pay property taxes, we pay excise taxes at the gas pump, we pay taxes every time we buy tires, we pay sales taxes to our state governments, a lot of us. All of us count as taxpayers in the two-word meaning, but only a few of us count as taxpayers, being the one-word defined legal term of people who are subject to internal revenue laws.
So let me ask you, so how did this get started where people, you know, you have these, it seems like our whole society is set up and everybody just assumes that this is something, that paying taxes on your personal income is something that you just do. How did it get started where, you know, you're saying that it's not, that's not necessarily, you know what I'm trying to say?
I do. The way the misunderstanding started was because of the use, whether deliberate or just by happenstance, of what are common terms: wages, trade or business, income, employment, employee, employer, all these common words that have a routine, universally understood meaning, being duplicated in the law with custom-defined terms that have the same sound and are spelled the same way, but are rendered in the law itself in quotation marks to distinguish them as being special terms with special meanings, as opposed to the common terms, the common words that we're accustomed to. The incorporation of those custom words without a great deal of effort being put into explaining to the public at large that these are actually defined terms with special meanings. Mm-hmm. That information can be found in the law to anyone who cares to look. But if you don't look and just take something on its face, if you get a notice from the government saying you have to pay a tax on all the wages you earned. Okay, technically that's true. If you earned the wages that they're talking about, which is the wages as custom defined in the law, that does represent taxable income, or represent income, I should say, and can lead to a tax.
That's where you lost me. Custom defined by the law.
Okay, the law says, for instance, that wages is defined as remuneration paid to employees. Okay, this is a starting point. Forgive me for using remuneration again, but this is one of the words in the law.
Okay.
We look a little further. Well, and if you go only that far and read only that part, wages means remuneration paid to employees. You would stop and think, well, everybody who works for somebody else is an employee. That means that everything that everyone is paid counts as income, right?
Right.
Well, it wouldn't mean that. But when we look a little further, we find that employee is also a defined term. And in fact, let me back up and say this. We've had a clue already that things are not what they seem to be, and that we can't make that presumption that because wages says remuneration paid to an employee, that it means everybody gets paid. And the clue is this. When a definition is provided in the law for something, that tells us that the thing being defined does not mean what it is commonly understood to mean. If it means what the dictionary says, what we all understand it to mean, what we all think it means, laws don't provide definitions. It's understood that if a controversy arises, this word will be taken to mean what everybody understands it to mean. But if a definition is provided, then we know it means something different. And in fact, not only does it mean something different, forgive me just one moment, Mary Ellen, but it means that the common meaning is entirely stripped away. That's the way a law is crafted and the way a law is intended to be read. If a definition is provided, it is not a definition in addition to a common definition. It means that there is no other definition. Whatever else we may have understood about that word is now gone completely. And the only thing that we can operate with is the definition provided in the law.
What I was going to ask is, how come I've never heard about this?
Because reading the law is time-consuming, grueling, difficult. Just the code version of the Internal Revenue laws, the federal Internal Revenue laws, is about 3.5 million words long. And that's a condensation of the actual laws. The laws themselves are about twice that much. So 7 million words. That's a lot to go through to find these little bits of critical data that are not made easy to find. It is not at all uncommon when going through the law to find that the key definition that explains the meaning of a fundamental linchpin term is itself 200,000 words away in an entirely different section of the law. Now, the lawmakers rely on people. They understand that one of the principles of our legal system is that it is the responsibility of each individual affected by a law to know what the law says. So they're able to sit back and say, hey, it's there.
So like when you sign a contract,
It's like when you sign a contract.
You read it. It's your fault.
How many of us actually read the fine print? You know, that is, you need a magnifying glass on the back page of everything we sign these days. Nobody does. But if it comes down to where there's a controversy associated with that fine print is going to count. And you're going to be presumed to have agreed to every bit of it when you signed. Same thing is true here. The lawmakers are able to, quite properly, sit back in the confidence that the responsibility for going to the trouble lies on the person that is going to be affected by the law. So, So we know that wages, in this definition, we've had that initial clue, we know that wages does not mean pay for labor in a routine sense, because that's the common definition, the common understanding, and we have a defined term here, so we know it doesn't have a common meaning. And it said that wages is remuneration paid to an employee. We look a little further in the law and we find that employee is a defined term also. And this clarifies, this provides the meaning of the definition of wages. Employee is defined as a federal employee or officer, an employee or officer of a federal, state instrumentality or organization, and the officer of a corporation, which we have to look in yet another law to find out that the corporation referred to in that definition is a federal corporation. There we have to go to the Public Salary Tax Act of 1939 to find where that definition applies and has found its way into the Internal Revenue laws directly.
Well, so most of us don't fit that definition, but we've still been paying taxes all this time because we thought we had to. Is there
Well,
anything?
that's because a notice was sent to you and everyone else saying, if you had wages, then you owe a tax accordingly, X percentage, against the amount of wages received, send in your money. And not knowing that there's a custom definition of wages, not knowing the limitations of the meaning of that term, you have presumed that that means anything you've earned constitutes income and that you have to pay a tax on it, and have just gone ahead and done that.
Well, isn't that fraudulent?
It
I mean,
isn't.
to present that, the government to present that to the American public, and then kind of assuming that we're gonna go along with it?
It's this close to fraudulent,
Okay,
but it isn't quite fraudulent, because the information is in the law.
all right, but if they put it out there that this is something that you have to do, and kind of under the guise of if you don't do it,
They never-
you're gonna get an audit, and you're gonna go to jail.
They never do.
And all that.
They never do. What they say is, if you've received wages, then you have to file a return and pay a tax accordingly, and do these various things. Now, again,
Is that written somewhere? Is that like a rule somewhere? I don't remember seeing that written down anywhere that says, X,
If you-
Y, Z, what you're saying.
that says if you have wages, you have to do these things, or,
Yeah. Because doesn't that contradict itself? If the government's saying, if you have wages, you have to pay this,
Mhm, that's correct.
okay? But they're kind of,
What they mean by, what you need to understand is that when the Internal Revenue Service sends a form, it is operating in the context of the Internal Revenue law. That's the only context that it exists in. So anything that comes from the Internal Revenue Service, anything that's related legally to the income tax, is affected by, is influenced by, is colored by the Internal Revenue laws. And so when a term such as wages shows up in anything that you see from any of those organizations, it has to be understood, and it is presumed that you understand that that means the wages as defined in the law, rather than the common word.
so basically what you're saying is that that document is, being sent out, and, or maybe not.
Well,
And
don't you
they're
get a tax return in the mail every year?
Yeah.
That just says.
Well, or they said,
bulletin.
go to the library and pick one up if you didn't get one.
Okay.
But,
They used to send them to everybody. I think they're cutting back on that a little bit now. They have people trained.
or
So
you
that
go online and you
people
print
go
one
out themselves and get a copy.
Yeah, right.
Well, with the advent of the web, they can print everything off they want and run on the website.
Yeah.
Well, it's more money for them,
But
think
what,
about it.
what I'm
Right?
getting
Yeah.
at is, so
Ironically.
So
right?
they're just the government is kind of going forward on the guise that everybody's just gonna go along with it, and it's kind of like what is that, that thing in the military, don't ask, don't tell,
Mm-hmm.
So they're,
Well, or even I like to think of it in the Wizard of Oz sense. when the four travelers finally make it into Oz's palace, and they go down that great hall, and they see the big the flaming ball of the face, And then Toto goes and tugs the little curtain aside, and that face hollers out, you know, don't look at that man behind the curtain. Just, you know, you don't look at me.
Yeah, look at me, don't look over here.
Right.
Don't look at the man behind the curtain. That's perfect, yeah. So the thing that I was thinking about a minute ago was, why does it take 7 million words when 3 would work? You know, why is it, so to me, if I'm thinking like that, I'm thinking, well, why is the government gonna have volumes and reams and reams and reams of all these documents that are convoluted, no one can understand them. I mean, heck, just reading a doggone W-9, like we were talking about before, is kind of intimidating, especially when you sign down there. But why is it 7 million words when 3 will do? It seems like it's a concerted effort somehow for them to keep people so confused that it even validates what you guys were just talking about. You know?
I've always been of two minds about the degree to which craft is at work by which I mean cunning is at work in designing this. And part of the reason why I can't conclude that that's the case is because all legal efforts are extended and drawn out and complicated and
Oh yeah,
you know,
any kind of
you know,
contract.
like the contract we were talking the backside of a you know, any form that we sign you know, for a private agreement that we were just talking about. It's got itself 10,000 words on the back. You know, everything they can cram in at you know, a 6-point type. It's just lawyers at work. Lawyers like to cover every base and not leave any openings if they can do it, and so they write it that way.
So
And in this case, forgive me, in this case, we're talking about a body of law by this point, which has been enacted, reenacted, reformed, added to very substantially about every 2 years since 1861. The first effective form was promulgated in 1862. They passed the tax to begin with in 1861, but dramatically reformed it, virtually replaced it in its entirety in 1862. And every other year from that point forward, another anywhere from 100 or 100 and a half pages of new enactment was added on, up to maybe 400 or 500 pages of enactment. So it's just built up. It's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger.
So your book helps us understand this. Is that the basis of this book you've written?
Cracking the Code, the fascinating truth about taxation in America, will equip any reader with a complete understanding of the limitations of tax law under the Constitution, the manner in which the internal revenue taxes incorporate and abide by those limitations, and the manner in which people are misled into misunderstanding about those limitations and how the tax applies or doesn't apply to them. And in addition, it provides some information about provisions for correcting the effects of the misunderstanding. The government recognizes it is not, and I said it was this close to a fraud. One of the reasons why it's only this close and not all the way is because the government recognizes that people can come to a misunderstanding, and it provides formal mechanisms for correcting the effects of that misunderstanding. If people
What do you mean?
if people end up creating bad information about each other by virtue of misunderstanding the law, they do it in a very formal process. They do it by the completion of forms, by creating affidavits, by signing documents about each other and about themselves. And if those documents are incorrect, there are corresponding forms and mechanisms and provisions in the law for correcting that bad information.
When you say bad information, are you talking about tax returns?
For instance, most people who pay other people in America, excuse me, are misled into creating what are called information returns about those payments. And an information return is nothing more and nothing less than an affidavit sworn under penalty of perjury declaring the payment of income, and that's income as defined in the law, not income as in the common use of the term or the word. So they've signed an affidavit declaring under penalty of perjury that they paid the recipient or the individual
Employee.
Identified worker
Yeah.
something that constituted income. And it's on the basis of that affidavit that a tax liability will be presumed.
Right.
Now, the person who has received this money is invited to,
The worker.
the worker, that's right, is invited to endorse this assertion, endorse what this affidavit says, by transferring that information to a 1040 and signing at the bottom saying everything on this document is completely true and correct to the best of my knowledge and belief,
Right.
and actually self-assessing as well, which is to say taking that amount of alleged income and multiplying it by the rate of tax and calculating a final tax figure and either sending it in or identifying withholding that's taken place and acknowledging that it's right for the government to keep it. And
Right.
that in and of itself is a revealing reality. Why is it that people are asked to sign under penalty of perjury a 1040? In most cases, the government already has the money. It's been withheld.
Right.
In the case of most workers, why is it necessary for somebody to sign something saying, okay, you can keep that money? It's revealing, very revealing by itself, that you are asked. And if you don't sign that document, believe me, they will come back to you and say, you forgot to sign your form. You know, you sent it in, but it's no good to us unless you sign it. Unless you tell us that.
Agreed.
That's right. Unless you give us the right to keep your money.
We're gonna keep your feet on the fire.
That's right.
Well, but if you're a worker, a lot of employees, if you don't have your social security card and you don't sign those forms, you don't have the job.
That's absolutely true. But having a social security number, and even providing a social security number or filling out a W-4, in and of itself doesn't transform anybody. In fact, nothing can transform somebody who is not a federal worker into a federal worker. There's no form that you can sign unless it's the civil service examination that makes you into a federal worker.
But we're all identified by our social security number. I mean, how do they, credit checks, the whole thing. I mean, it's the only way, seems to me like it's the only way the government, or one way, now we know they have many ways, but to keep track of people, I mean.
That's true. I mean, but before social security numbers, let's remember, there's only been a social security system since 1935. We've had the income tax for long before that.
When it's bankrupt or
Long before that.
Yeah.
And people have had records kept on them for long before that as well. Used to be, we would keep records using just a more complicated identifying mechanism. We would use our name, our address, date of birth. These things all added together constituted a legally definitive or legally sufficient identifier. Now we have a simpler mechanism because people have gone ahead and voluntarily associated, for the most part voluntarily, associated all that other information with this one number. I'm not a fan of social security numbers being used for anything other than their intended purpose, but I don't see it as the work of Satan either. It's not some demonic process. It's just a convenience. It's a convenience for your credit company to be able to
Yeah, it's kind
type in one number and get all this information because that's been associated with that number by everybody else too. So, and having a social security number doesn't make a person subject to the social security system. What a social security number does as far as the tax law is concerned is it provides an account number for the occasions in which one does receive something that constitutes social security income. Social security, the social security tax is just an income tax. It's just an income tax with a different name.
It seems that, CPAs are kind of the baggage carrier of this whole thing. I mean, didn't they read the tax code when they were in the process of getting their certification and passing that class?
Interestingly, the IRS does a lot of training of CPAs.
I bet they do.
I bet they do.
make transfers the equivalent of Social Security, which is something in which the recipient has no ownership interest whatsoever and cannot transfer to heirs or assigns. I want to do the same thing with the general wealth and tax a substantial portion of that on the passage. The expenditure of money is not, for the most part, expenditure on charities and situations of dire need. It's expenditure on boondoggles. It's expenditure on pork. There is some charitable spending that goes on, but not one bit of it that couldn't be more efficiently administered by the direct giving of the money from the person who earned it to the recipient charity. Anytime something passes through managerial hands or bureaucratic hands between the producer and the recipient, there's obviously a loss. This is economics 101. You don't pass something through a third party without having some economic friction involved. And so to eliminate the tax and eliminate the middleman in distributing wealth from the producer to a charitable beneficiary, a charitable recipient, would simply make it more efficiently accomplished. So there's no reason why anyone should presume that anyone is going to, that Americans are going to suffer as a consequence of the income tax being eliminated. It's quite the contrary. Americans are going to benefit from the income tax being eliminated. Taking the heavy hand of the federal government, or the federal and state governments combined, off the American economy is going to do nothing but prove to be an enormous shot in the arm for that economy. It's going to bounce up so strongly that, for one thing, many of the legitimate charity cases that do exist will no longer be charity cases. They will be people readily able to provide for themselves. The few charity cases that remain will be the beneficiaries of the good wishes and charitable dollars from not only the people who are currently doing well enough to be able to afford such expenditures, but the people who themselves had previously been charity cases and who are now in a position to give themselves. There's nothing but upside to eliminating the misunderstanding of the income tax and seeing to it that those Americans to whom it does not legitimately apply under the law are freed from having to cope with it. This is the rising tide that raises all boats.
That's right.
No question about it. In fact, we see that argument made all the time. You know, one half of the political spectrum is more than willing to argue on a regular basis in favor of tax cuts. And they make their arguments, and they're perfectly good arguments based on the notion that they will invigorate the economy. Let's extend that. Let's eliminate the tax entirely. What will that do? That's a tsunami. That's more than a rising tide. That's a tidal wave. And the boats will rise high. For one thing, almost all government spending, the vast majority of it, aside from just a few areas of essential services, such as defense and the maintenance of the judiciary, amount to the financing of activities against my own interests. They amount to financing government agencies and bureaucracies whose mission is to interfere in my daily affairs. They go to finance people who are going to look over my shoulder and tell me how to run my life. And so every one of those dollars spent is a dollar spent against me. And I don't like any of it at all. Another large percentage of it is spent interfering with the affairs of other countries. And I don't like that either. And I don't like the effects of that. We will continue to be the servant in reality, however much we may be the master in name.
So we're still the servant.
Absolutely, we're the servant.
How do we get that rolled back?
We take the money away. You know, the Constitution, the structure, both the fundamental law and the statutory structure that was produced in keeping with that fundamental law, don't provide for the federal government to have command and control of our money. They absolutely do not. The founders recognized the reality of who controls the purse strings and what that means, and they saw to it that we retained control of the purse strings. And so it's only the misunderstanding that suggests that income means all that comes in, and that the 16th Amendment authorized a tax on all that comes in, and so on and so forth. It's that misunderstanding that has given control of the purse strings, control of the master's wealth to the servant, government, and allowed that role reversal to take place. It isn't because that reversal has actually taken place, it's because we have sat back complacently while the master in this case is sleeping in the chair and the servant is convincing him in his sleep to hand over the wallet. And the master is doing that. So while the servant still sleeps in the servant's quarters and wears the servant's uniform, he's become the master in reality.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll say that again. Free people don't live this way. Free people don't sit at a desk with a mountain of receipts and slips of paper around them, busily filling out forms to satisfy the interests of bureaucrats. That's not the way America works. That's not what our system is. And as a matter of fact, it really isn't what our system is. And the beauty of learning the truth about the income tax is learning that that isn't for you anymore. That isn't in your future. It isn't in your job description. It isn't in your citizenship description. And you can and should be free of it.
We're talking about intellectual revolution, if anything else.
That's right.
Right?
It's just a revolution of standing up, learning the truth, acting on what you learn, and insisting that our servant government remember its rule. No bloodshed, no violence, none's necessary. The law is on the side of American freedom. The law is on the side of those who would learn and act on the truth.
Yeah.
People aren't free. People in this country are feeling the walls closing in on them. And in America, that is doubly a tragedy and doubly depressing, doubly likely to produce pathologies, because we have a heritage of freedom. We have a heritage that's quite the contrary, and we know it. We are taught it when we're children. When we're children and we're in grade school, we get taught all these wonderful things about our American system. We get taught, we're told over and over again, we live in a free society. And we know that doesn't mean that we're spared being the subjects of the King of England. We know what free means. We know free means that we're empowered to do what we wish with our lives and our liberty and in the pursuit of happiness with our property. We know that we have rights recognized under the Constitution, rights to speak, rights to associate freely, rights to travel, and on and on. We're told all these things, we're taught all these things when we're children, and as we grow up, what do we discover? We discover these things really aren't true. We don't have these rights. At least these rights are not honored. They're not honored by our government. We're not allowed to speak freely. We are not allowed to associate freely. We're not allowed to do many, many things that we were taught as children were our natural heritage. And we find ourselves supervised by our government in virtually everything we do. How much of that can you take? How much of that can anybody handle without some psychological reaction? To have somebody looking over your shoulder, looking into your affairs, able to go through your stuff, your papers and effects, so to speak, anytime they want to. That's the sense that Americans have today, is that anytime some pinhead bureaucrat in Washington decides to poke through your stuff, they can just show up at your door and do it. They don't even have to have a reason. They don't have to be able to cite some issue, something you've done, some suspicion that's been raised about you. They can just show up at your door and say, hey Smith, we want to look through your desk. How could people not be depressed in a situation like that? That's a real depressing thought.